Everyone keeps asking the same question: what has Mark Carney actually done? And depending on who you listen to, the answer is either basically nothing or he's quietly reshaping the economy. Those two things cannot both be true, so let's actually test the claim properly.
This is the Sanity Project, cutting through political nonsense with clarity, facts, and just a little bit of attitude.
Tonight, Abby is going to make the strongest possible case that Carney hasn't delivered. Not a weak argument, not a straw man, but the real concerns Canadians are voicing. Then I'm going to walk through what his government has actually done, using real numbers, real policies, and verifiable outcomes. Because this matters. If the criticism is fair, we should say it clearly. But if the record is stronger than the narrative, we should say that too. And once you separate perception from policy, the story becomes a lot more complex than the headlines suggest.
All right, here's the strongest version of the criticism. Mark Carney became Prime Minister in March 2025, and Canadians were told he would bring economic credibility, stability, and a clear plan. About a year later, many people are still asking where the results actually are. Housing affordability remains one of the biggest issues in the country. Average home prices in major cities remain hundreds of thousands of dollars above what many first-time buyers can afford, and rents in urban centers continue to consume a large share of household income. On the job side, this is not a strong rebound story either. Statistics Canada reported the unemployment rate at 6.7% in February 2026, up slightly from the previous month and essentially flat year over year. That is not what people expect from an improving economy. Inflation has cooled compared to previous peaks, but food prices and essential goods remain noticeably higher than they were just a few years ago. For many households, wage growth has not fully kept pace with those increases, which keeps financial pressure elevated. So the criticism resonates because it reflects real experience. Carney talks about investment, competitiveness, and long-term growth, but many Canadians are still waiting to feel meaningful change in their day-to-day lives, and that gap drives the skepticism.
That is a fair challenge, and it deserves a serious answer. But once you separate what people feel immediately from what a government has actually implemented, the picture changes. Because the claim that nothing has been done simply does not match the policy record. First, let's talk about Budget 2025. The government outlined roughly $280 billion in capital investment over 5 years, or about $450 billion on a cash basis. It also aims to enable up to $1 trillion in total investment through public and private partnerships combined. That distinction matters. The government is not directly spending $1 trillion, but it is using policy tools, incentives, and co-investment strategies to attract private capital. That is a long-term economic model designed to scale investment beyond public spending alone. Second, the productivity superdeduction and investment incentives. These measures allow businesses to expense a much larger share of capital investments immediately, including equipment, clean energy systems, and technology infrastructure, improving cash flow and lowering upfront cost barriers. Government estimates suggest these policies could generate roughly $9 billion in additional economic output annually over time, while supporting billions of dollars in new business investment. The goal is to improve productivity, a long-standing weakness in Canada's economy. Third, buy Canadian policies tied to federal spending. The government has signaled that up to $70 billion in public investment could be directed toward Canadian goods, services, and infrastructure projects, strengthening domestic supply chains and supporting local industries. This is a strategic shift in procurement policy. Instead of purely cost-based decisions, the government is prioritizing domestic economic impact, which could support manufacturing, construction, and resource sectors that rely heavily on stable, long-term demand. Fourth, trade diversification. And this is where things get more strategic. Budget 2025 includes a $5 billion trade diversification corridors fund focused on ports, rail, and logistics infrastructure to expand Canada's ability to move goods efficiently to non-US markets. This matters because Canada still sends roughly 70 to 75% of its exports to the United States. That level of concentration creates risk, especially during trade disputes, tariffs, or shifts in U.S. policy that Canada has limited control over. But the infrastructure funding is only one piece of the story. Over the past year, Carney's government has been actively engaging in trade missions and early-stage agreements to strengthen relationships with markets in Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Indo-Pacific region. Rather than announcing sweeping new free trade agreements overnight, the strategy has focused on memoranda of understanding, investment frameworks, and sector-specific partnerships in areas such as energy, critical minerals, and advanced manufacturing supply chains. For example, Canada has continued to expand its role within existing agreements, such as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, while also pursuing deeper engagement with countries like India through ongoing negotiations and exploratory talks. These agreements are not instant economic wins. They are groundwork. Trade diversification takes years because it involves infrastructure, regulatory alignment, supply chain development, and long-term business investment decisions that do not move at political speed. So the honest way to describe this is not that Carney has completed major trade deals, but that his government has actively shifted Canada's trade strategy, investing in infrastructure and building the early-stage relationships required to reduce long-term dependence on a single market. Fifth, middle-class tax relief. The federal government reduced the lowest personal income tax rate from 15% to 14%, affecting nearly 22 million Canadians. This results in up to $420 in annual savings per individual and up to $840 for dual-income households. That is not transformative on its own, but it is measurable and immediate. It increases take-home pay, and for many households, even modest tax relief helps offset rising costs in other areas like housing, transportation, and food. Sixth, first-time homebuyer GST relief. The government eliminated GST on new homes priced up to $1 million for first-time buyers and reduced it on homes up to $1.5 million. This can result in savings of up to $50,000, depending on the purchase price. While this does not solve supply constraints or broader affordability challenges, it directly reduces upfront costs for eligible buyers. It is a targeted policy designed to help younger Canadians enter the housing market. Seventh, the National School Food Program. The government committed $1 billion over 5 years to make the program permanent and expand access across provinces and territories, supporting children and families while addressing food insecurity. This is not an economic growth policy in the traditional sense, but it is a cost of living support measure. It reduces household expenses for families and ensures more consistent access to nutrition for students across the country. So when you look at the full list, the accurate criticism is not that nothing has happened. The more accurate criticism is that many of these policies are still early in their impact cycle and have not yet translated into visible, everyday improvements.
And that is exactly where the frustration comes from. Because from a voter's perspective, the distinction between long-term policy and short-term results does not matter nearly as much as whether life feels easier, more affordable, and more stable right now. If housing is still expensive, if jobs feel uncertain, and if everyday costs are still high, people will question whether these policies are working, regardless of how strong they look on paper.
And that is the core tension in this conversation. If the claim is that Mark Carney has already fixed affordability, housing, and economic pressure in 1 year, that is clearly not supported by the data or by lived experience. But if the claim is that he has done nothing, that is also not supported by the evidence. There is a substantial body of legislation, fiscal policy, and investment strategy already in motion, backed by funding, timelines, and measurable objectives. The gap we are seeing is between action and visible impact. Large-scale economic policy takes time to filter through the system. Infrastructure projects can take years. Business investment decisions take time, and productivity improvements do not show up overnight. That does not invalidate the frustration people feel. It highlights the reality that economic transformation operates on a longer timeline than political expectations. And that gap is exactly where competing narratives, both supportive and critical, tend to take hold. So here is the honest answer. Has Mark Carney transformed daily life for Canadians in 1 year? No. Has he done nothing? Also no. He has implemented policies, passed legislation, and launched economic initiatives that are already in motion. The real debate is not whether anything has been done. It is whether these policies will deliver meaningful results and whether they will do so fast enough to matter to Canadians. That is the conversation worth having. If you found this useful, subscribe. And if you think I missed something or got something wrong, drop it in the comments. Let's break it down together.
This has been the Sanity Project, because politics should make sense. Subscribe for more.